In 2008, the global economy collapsed. Banks were drowning. Millions lost their homes. And yet somehow the billionaires who helped cause the crisis walked away richer than before. No consequences, just bailouts funded by ordinary taxpayers. How does that happen? How do people who never appear on a ballot end up writing the rules that govern your life? This video exposes the playbook billionaires use to quietly shape laws, policies, and entire governments, all while staying invisible. By the end, you'll understand exactly how power really works in modern democracies and why your vote might matter less than you think. The most obvious tool in the billionaire influence toolkit is lobbying, but most people dramatically underestimate just how massive this industry has become. In 2023 alone, corporations and wealthy individuals spent over $4.2 billion on federal lobbying in the United States. That's not campaign donations. That's not charity. That's money paid directly to professional persuaders whose entire job is to sit in lawmakers' offices and convince them to vote a certain way. The pharmaceutical industry leads the pack, spending over $350 million annually just to make sure drug pricing laws stay favorable. When Medicare was finally allowed to negotiate drug prices in 2022, it was a watered-down version of what reformers originally wanted, because lobbyists spent decades ensuring the final bill had enough loopholes to protect profit margins. But here's what makes lobbying truly effective. It's not really about bribery in the traditional sense. These lobbyists are often former congresspeople, former senators, or former high-ranking government officials. This revolving door between public service and private lobbying creates a situation where the people writing laws today know they might be paid handsomely tomorrow to help corporations avoid those same laws. One Louisiana congressman helped pass the 2003 Medicare Modernization Act, which specifically banned the government from negotiating drug prices, then left Congress and immediately became the CEO of the largest pharmaceutical lobbying group at a salary of over $2 million per year. Coincidence? The timeline suggests otherwise. Now, lobbying is legal and regulated, at least in theory. But campaign finance is where things get genuinely wild. The 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision fundamentally changed American politics by ruling that corporations and wealthy individuals could spend unlimited amounts of money on political advertising through super PACs. The theory was that this money would be independent of campaigns and therefore couldn't corrupt politicians. In practice, this created a parallel campaign system where billionaires could pour hundreds of millions into elections without any meaningful limits. Consider what happened in 2012 when a single casino billionaire and his wife donated over $150 million to Republican candidates and causes. In 2020, that same family gave another $215 million. That's not normal political engagement. That's purchasing influence at scale. When you can write a check that exceeds the entire campaign budget of most congressional candidates, politicians start paying very close attention to your policy preferences. This particular donor was famously hawkish on Israel policy and opposed online gambling that might compete with his casinos. Remarkably, the Republican Party's positions aligned perfectly with both priorities. The Democrats have their own mega donors, of course. Progressive billionaires have spent billions funding left-leaning causes and candidates. One former New York mayor dropped over $1 billion on his own failed presidential campaign and continues to fund gun control and climate initiatives. The point isn't that one side does this and the other doesn't. The point is that billionaires on both sides have discovered that political spending offers exceptional returns on investment. A few million spent on the right senator can yield billions in favorable tax treatment or regulatory decisions. But campaign donations are still relatively visible. What's far more insidious is the think tank ecosystem that billionaires have built to manufacture intellectual cover for their preferred policies. Think tanks sound academic and neutral. Names like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Brookings Institution, or the American Enterprise Institute carry an air of scholarly legitimacy. But these organizations are largely funded by wealthy donors who expect their money to produce research that supports specific conclusions. Conservative think tanks produce papers arguing for lower taxes and deregulation. Libertarian institutes churn out policy prescriptions favoring minimal government intervention. When a senator wants to justify cutting corporate taxes, there's conveniently a stack of industry-funded studies ready to cite. This creates a brilliant system of policy laundering. A billionaire can't walk into Congress and say, "Make my taxes lower because it benefits me personally." But when that same billionaire funds a think tank that produces research claiming tax cuts will boost economic growth and create jobs, suddenly the self-serving policy gets dressed up in the language of public interest. Politicians can cite these studies with straight faces, journalists report on them as legitimate policy debates, and the billionaire's fingerprints remain conveniently invisible. One family of industrialist billionaires perfected this model over decades. Starting in the 1970s, they invested hundreds of millions into building an interconnected network of think tanks, academic programs, advocacy groups, and political organizations. The goal was explicitly ideological: reshape American political thought to favor free markets, minimal regulation, and lower taxes on the wealthy. This wasn't charity. This was long-term strategic investment in political infrastructure, and it worked spectacularly. Ideas that were considered fringe in the 1970s, like eliminating the minimum wage or privatizing Social Security, became mainstream Republican positions by the 2000s, promoted by an army of think tank scholars and policy experts that this network had cultivated. Media ownership represents another avenue of influence that's often overlooked. When a tech titan purchased one of America's most influential newspapers in 2013 for $250 million, many wondered what he wanted with a struggling publication. The official answer was that he simply wanted to save a great American institution. The more cynical interpretation is that owning one of the most influential political newspapers in the country, one that covers the federal government more closely than any other publication, gives you enormous soft power. The owner doesn't need to call editors and demand favourable coverage. The mere fact of ownership creates subtle pressures and conflicts of interest that can shape coverage in ways that benefit his company's interests. Another media mogul's influence is even more direct. Through a major cable news network, a prestigious financial newspaper, and media properties across multiple continents, this single billionaire has spent decades shaping conservative politics in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. Politicians who want favourable coverage from his properties understand they need to stay in his good graces. This doesn't require explicit deals or threats. The dynamic is understood by everyone involved. Former British Prime Ministers have described the ritual of courting his approval before elections, knowing that tabloid coverage could make or break their campaigns. The pattern becomes clear. Billionaires don't need to run for office because they've built systems that are far more efficient than holding office. An elected official serves a term, faces re-election pressures, and can be voted out. But the lobbying firms keep operating, the think tanks keep publishing, the super PACs keep spending, the media empires keep broadcasting. These institutions persist across election cycles, shaping the boundaries of what's politically possible, regardless of who technically holds power. By the time a policy debate reaches the public, billionaire-funded organizations have already spent years framing the terms of that debate, funding the research that supports their preferred outcomes, and cultivating relationships with the politicians who will vote on it. Philanthropy might seem like the one area where billionaire influence is genuinely benevolent. After all, what's wrong with rich people giving away money to good causes? But strategic philanthropy has become one of the most sophisticated tools for shaping public policy while generating positive press coverage. When a billionaire donates $100 million to education reform, that donation comes with strings attached. A particular vision of how education should work, which often aligns with privatization, charter schools, and weakening teachers' unions. The recipients of this generosity quickly learn what kinds of proposals get funded and which ones don't. Over time, entire fields of policy research become tilted toward the preferences of their wealthy benefactors. The Gates Foundation offers a striking example of how this works. With an endowment exceeding $70 billion, this single philanthropic organization has shaped global health policy, American education reform, and agricultural development across Africa. When you're spending more on global health than most countries' entire health budgets, your priorities become everyone's priorities. The Foundation's emphasis on technological solutions, vaccines, genetically modified crops, data-driven education, reflects the worldview of its tech industry founders. Alternative approaches that might challenge corporate interests or require systemic political change simply don't get funded at the same scale. This isn't conspiracy. It's just how incentives work when one funding source dominates an entire field. Philanthropy also provides excellent reputation laundering. A billionaire whose company engages in aggressive tax avoidance, union busting, or environmental destruction can simultaneously cultivate an image as a generous humanitarian. Museums, universities, and hospitals proudly display donor names on buildings, creating an aura of civic virtue that obscures how that wealth was accumulated in the first place. When criticism arises, defenders point to the charitable giving as evidence of good character. The philanthropy doesn't offset the harm, but it very effectively muddies the public conversation about whether these individuals deserve the influence they wield. Regulatory capture represents perhaps the most technical but devastating form of billionaire influence. The concept is simple. Industries gradually take control of the government agencies designed to regulate them. This happens through a combination of lobbying, revolving door hiring, and the sheer complexity of specialized industries. When the Federal Aviation Administration needs experts who understand aircraft safety, where do they find them? The aerospace industry. When the Securities and Exchange Commission needs people who understand complex financial instruments, who has that expertise? Wall Street. Over time, regulators begin to see the world through the eyes of the industries they're supposed to police. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated regulatory capture at its most destructive. For years, banking regulators had been staffed with former industry executives who genuinely believed that Wall Street could regulate itself. Warning signs about subprime mortgages and over-leveraged banks were ignored or downplayed. When the system finally collapsed, these same captured agencies argued that the banks were too big to fail and needed taxpayer bailouts to survive. The foxes hadn't just been guarding the henhouse, they'd convinced everyone that henhouse security was best left to fox experts. This pattern repeats across virtually every regulated industry. Environmental agencies get staffed with former fossil fuel executives who delay climate regulations. Telecommunications regulators approve mergers that reduce competition because they've absorbed the industry's arguments about efficiency and innovation. Pharmaceutical regulators fast-track drug approvals based on industry-funded studies while under-resourcing long-term safety monitoring. The public rarely notices because these regulatory battles happen in obscure proceedings filled with technical jargon. But the consequences, higher prices, environmental damage, financial instability, unsafe products, affect everyone. What makes regulatory capture particularly insidious is that it's perfectly legal and often doesn't even require bad intentions. Industry veterans who move into regulatory roles genuinely believe they're bringing valuable expertise to public service. They've simply internalized their former employer's worldview so completely that they can't imagine alternatives. The billionaires funding industry lobbying groups understand this dynamic perfectly. They don't need to bribe regulators, they just need to ensure that the pipeline of qualified candidates comes from the right backgrounds with the right assumptions about how markets should work. The international dimension of billionaire influence deserves attention because it reveals how these strategies operate across different political systems. In the United Kingdom, the honours system, knighthoods, peerages, and other titles has long been intertwined with political donations. Major, donors to political parties have a suspicious tendency to end up in the House of Lords, where they can directly vote on legislation. One investigation found that over half of the Conservative Party's major donors had received honours. The practice is so normalised that it barely registers as scandal anymore, even though it essentially allows wealthy individuals to purchase legislative seats. Russia presents an extreme version of oligarchic influence, where billionaires and political power became so intertwined after the Soviet collapse that separating them became nearly impossible. Fortunes were made through privatization deals that required political connections, and maintaining those fortunes required continued political protection. The result was a system where billionaires didn't just influence government, they became inseparable from it. While Western democracies haven't reached this level of fusion, the trajectory is worth noting as a warning about where unchecked billionaire influence can lead. Even countries with strong democratic traditions face these pressures. Australia has seen mining billionaires fund massive advertising campaigns against proposed taxes on their industry, successfully turning public opinion and forcing policy retreats. In India, industrial conglomerates have grown so powerful that their investment decisions can make or break state governments' economic plans, giving them implicit veto power over policies they dislike. The specific mechanisms vary, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Concentrated wealth translates into concentrated political power, regardless of formal democratic structures. Technology has added new dimensions to billionaire political influence. Social media platforms owned by the ultra-wealthy now control the information environment in which political debates occur. Algorithmic decisions about what content gets promoted or suppressed can shape public opinion more effectively than any newspaper editorial. When a single tech billionaire can purchase one of the world's largest social networks and immediately change its content moderation policies, that represents political power of a kind that didn't exist a generation ago. The owner doesn't need to tell users what to think. He just needs to adjust the algorithms that determine what they see. Artificial intelligence development is creating new frontiers for this influence. The billionaires funding AI research will shape the values and capabilities built into systems that might eventually affect everything from hiring decisions to criminal sentencing to military targeting. Governments desperately want this technology, but lack the expertise to develop it themselves, creating dependency relationships with the tech billionaires who control the most advanced AI labs. This dynamic gives these individuals leverage over public policy that extends far beyond their formal citizenship or official roles. So what does all this mean for ordinary people trying to participate in democracy? The uncomfortable truth is that voting, while still important, operates within boundaries that billionaire influence has already shaped. The candidates who make it through primary elections have typically already secured wealthy backers. The policy options presented as realistic have been pre-filtered through think tanks funded by interested parties. The information voters use to make decisions flows through media properties owned by billionaires with their own agendas. None of this means democracy is a complete sham, but it does mean that democratic participation requires understanding these dynamics rather than pretending they don't exist. The billionaire playbook works because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Lobbying handles the day-to-day legislative battles. Campaign finance secures access and loyalty from elected officials. Think tanks manufacture intellectual justification for preferred policies. Media ownership shapes the boundaries of acceptable public debate. Philanthropy generates goodwill and deflects criticism. Regulatory capture ensures that even when laws pass, enforcement remains friendly. Each mechanism reinforces the others, creating a self-sustaining system that persists regardless of which party holds nominal power. Understanding this system is the first step toward challenging it, because billionaires succeed in shaping democracy precisely when citizens don't realize it's happening.